Nobody's going to know, Captain Whitmore said and laughed. It was the kind of laugh that belongs to a man alone in a room he believes is sealed low, satisfied, the laugh of someone who has gotten away with something and intends to keep getting away with it. He settled into the left seat of the cockpit, adjusted his harness, and looked out at the gray October morning pressing against the windshield of Alaska Airlines Flight 391, and he felt, as he had felt for the past 9 days, perfectly safe from the consequences of his own decisions. First Officer Daniel Reeves was running radio checks at the right seat, his fingers moving across the instrument panel with the slightly reverent attention of a young pilot who still found the machinery of flight genuinely beautiful, who still felt a small private thrill every time the avionics came alive and the instrument panel filled with light and data and the accumulated intelligence of modern aviation. He was 31 years old and had been flying commercially for 3 years, and he still loved it the way you love something before it becomes ordinary. He glanced over at Whitmore, caught the tail end of the laugh, and didn't ask about it because Whitmore was not the kind of captain you asked about things, and Reeves had learned this quickly. Whitmore was 53, heavyset with a thick wave of hair that had once been genuinely blonde and had faded over the years into something closer to platinum, the kind of silver yellow that sits in the narrow space between distinguished and just gone gray. He had logged over 12,000 flight hours across 19 years, and he knew this aircraft the way he knew his own kitchen. The feel of the controls, the particular sounds, each phase of flight made the way the Boeing 757 settled into cruise altitude, like a large animal finding its preferred position. He had been flying long enough to stop finding wonder in it, long enough to start finding inconvenience instead. The inconvenience specifically was a carbon monoxide sensor mounted near the left circuit breaker panel in this cockpit, a small device about the size of a deck of cards whose job was to detect the presence of the colorless, odorless gas that could kill both pilots in their seats before either of them understood what was happening. The sensor had been showing a fault reading for 9 days. A maintenance work order had been filed on day 1, assigned a priority placed in the active queue. On day 4, Captain Whitmore, who had a vacation booked for the following week, who did not want this aircraft grounded, who had decided after 19 years of experience that he understood better than any maintenance protocol what was and was not a critical system issue, had pulled the work order from the active queue, marked it as deferred, and signed his own name to the deferral without telling anyone. He had pocketed the repair budget allocated to the fix and filed paperwork that described the sensor as non-essential, a redundant system, something to be addressed at the next major maintenance window. He had done this to save time. He had a vacation coming up. What Whitmore did not understand what the paperwork he had falsified had been specifically designed to prevent someone like him from having to face was that the ventilation system of this particular aircraft had developed a slow, persistent leak in a heat exchanger behind the forward bulkhead. A leak that had been producing trace amounts of carbon monoxide for the past 6 days. Trace amounts that were on their own meaningless. Trace amounts that would, over the course of a 2.5-hour flight at altitude with 2 adults sitting in an enclosed, pressurized space, accumulate into something that was very far from meaningless. The gas was already moving through the cockpit ventilation system as Whitmore ran his pre-flight checklist, odorless and colorless, following paths of least resistance. The way water follows cracks in rock, quietly, persistently patient, in the way that things without consciousness are patient, simply doing what physics required of them. The sensor that would have detected it was dark. The man who had darkened it was running through a checklist with the automated efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and believed with complete certainty that he would do it 1,000 more. Behind them, 222 people were settling into their seats, stowing their bags, accepting small cups of orange juice from the flight attendants, adjusting their headphones, pulling out their books, sending the last text messages they would send for the next few hours. They were business people and students, and a 72-year-old man named Gerald Okafor, who was flying to Denver to watch his granddaughter receive her nursing degree. They were a woman named Patricia Huang, who was going to a conference on educational policy and who had made a mental note to call her daughter from the layover. They were ordinary people doing the ordinary thing that ordinary people do on an ordinary Tuesday in October, which is to say they were trusting the aircraft, trusting the airline, trusting the man in the left seat who had just finished laughing at a joke that only he was in on. None of them knew what he had decided about their lives. Zara Coleman woke up at 5:15 a.m. in her grandmother's house in Seattle's Beacon Hill neighborhood and did not need to check the time because she had been awake for 20 minutes already lying in the dark with the particular alertness of someone whose mind had decided that sleep was finished and that the day should begin, which was a habit she had inherited from her mother and which her grandmother said with a mixture of affection and mild exasperation was the single most inconvenient thing about both of them. She pulled on her favorite hoodie, faded navy blue soft from years of washing with small silver wings embroidered on the left sleeve. A gift from her Uncle Wren 2 birthdays ago, given without ceremony, sat on the kitchen table, with a note that said simply for when you need them, and which Zara had worn so often since that the cuffs had started to fray at the edges, and her grandmother had offered twice to replace it, and Zara had declined both times because some things are worth keeping precisely because they are worn. She dragged her roller bag to the front door and stood there for a moment in the quiet house, listening to the particular silence of early morning, which is not really silence at all but a lower register of all the sounds that the day will eventually amplify. Her grandmother appeared from the kitchen holding a paper bag of onigiri, rice, and salmon, and seaweed wrapped in the way that only her grandmother's hands knew how to wrap them tight and neat and somehow warm, even when they weren't. And she took Zara's face in both palms and held it the way she always did, before long trips, studying her granddaughter's dark eyes as if she were trying to find something there or leave something there or simply memorize what was already there so she would have it while Zara was gone. "Call me when you land," her grandmother said. "I always do, Oba-chan," Zara said. "I know. Call me anyway." Zara smiled, kissed her grandmother's cheek, and walked out into the cold October air without looking back. If she had turned around, she would have seen her grandmother standing at the window for a long time after the taxi pulled away, one hand pressed flat against the glass, her breath making a small cloud on the cold surface that faded and came back and faded again. SeaTac Airport was already moving by the time Zara arrived, the particular organized chaos of an early morning hub filling the terminal with the sound of rolling luggage and PA announcements, and the smell of coffee from the stands that opened at 4 a.m. for people who needed it more than they needed anything else. Her escort from the unaccompanied minor program, a woman named Dana, who checked her phone at every pause and smiled with the automatic warmth of someone who worked with children often enough that warmth had become reflexive, walked her through security with practiced efficiency, and Zara navigated the body scanner and retrieved her backpack from the conveyor belt and slipped her shoes back on with the smooth competence of someone who had done this many times before. "You've done this before," Dana observed, noticing. "Big family in Boston," Zara said. "My dad teaches at MIT. I fly back and forth a lot." She paused. "He studies fluid dynamics." Dana smiled politely. She didn't ask what fluid dynamics was. Gate B-17 was crowded in the way that gates are always crowded on Tuesday mornings, the seats filled with the particular cross-section of humanity that air travel reliably produces: a businessman 2 seats down conducting a phone call about quarterly projections with the volume and conviction of someone who believed the rest of the terminal was genuinely interested, a young mother across the aisle trying to negotiate apple slices into a toddler who had decided that apple slices were the specific enemy, 2 college students sleeping across 3 chairs each with their backpacks as pillows, and the profound unconcern of people who could sleep anywhere and intended to prove it. None of them looked at Zara. Nobody ever did. That was fine with her. She pulled out her book, a worn paperback copy of Wolfgang Langewies's Stick and Rudder, the spine creased from multiple readings pages marked in 3 different colors of pen by her Uncle Wren's hand, With marginal notes in his careful engineer's handwriting that she had read so many times, she could recite some of them and opened it to the dog-eared page near Chapter 9. The section on coordination, the part where Langewiesche talked about how pilots confuse skidding turns with properly coordinated turns and spend years not understanding why their aircraft never feels quite right. She had read this chapter 4 times. She was reading it again because Wren had told her once that you didn't truly understand something until you could explain it to someone else in plain language, and she was still working on the plain language. Her mother's name had been Zara Coleman, and she had been in the considered opinion of everyone who had ever watched her fly one of the most gifted aviators they had encountered, which, given that Zara's Uncle Wren was a decorated naval aviator with 1,400 hours of fixed-wing time and had flown off carriers in weather that most civilian pilots would have refused to take off in, was saying something that mattered. Diane had flown aerobatics. Not recreationally, not as a hobby that she mentioned at dinner parties competitively seriously, with the focused dedication of someone who understood that the difference between very good and truly exceptional was measured in fractions of a second and degrees of attitude and the 1,000 small decisions that happened faster than conscious thought. She had competed at the national level, threading her single-engine Extra 300 through sequences of rolls and snaps and hammerheads that made other pilots go quiet when they watched the particular silence of people who are competent enough to understand exactly how difficult what they are watching actually is. She had loved the sky the way some people love the ocean, not because it was safe, not because it forgave mistakes, but precisely because it demanded everything you had and returned nothing except the truth about what you were made of. She died when Zara was 7 years old. A mechanical failure during a practice run 300 feet above a field in Oregon on a clear afternoon in September. The NTSB investigation took 6 months and produced a report that was 44 pages long and concluded in the careful, neutral language of federal aviation investigators that the failure had originated in a component that should have been caught during the most recent maintenance inspection and had not been, and that the outcome was in the formal phrase the report used not survivable given the altitude at the time of the failure. Zara had read every word of that report. She had been 9 years old when she finished the first reading, sitting at the kitchen table in the house in Seattle, while her grandmother made tea in the kitchen and pretended not to be watching. She had read it twice more since then, not because she was looking for something she hadn't found the first time, but because reading it was a way of honoring the specificity of what had happened, refusing to let it blur into the general shape of grief, insisting on keeping it particular and exact, because her mother had been particular and exact, and deserved to be remembered that way. Her Uncle Wren had not responded to Diane's death with speeches or grand gestures or any of the formal language of comfort that adults deploy when they are trying to do something about pain and discovering that nothing they say is adequate. He had responded by showing up and by doing something specific. 6 weeks after the funeral, he had driven Zara to a small airfield outside of Bremerton and walked her out to a Cessna 172 that belonged to a flying club there, and he had said, "Get in, I'll show you what she saw." He taught her to feel the aircraft, not just to operate it, but to listen to it, to understand the difference between the sounds it made when everything was working correctly and the sounds it made when something wanted attention. The way her mother had taught her to listen to music, not just for the notes, but for the space between them, for the silence that gave each note its meaning. By the time Zara was 9 years old, she could perform a coordinated turn in instrument meteorological conditions, the aircraft wrapped in cloud, nothing outside the windows but white navigating entirely by the instruments in front of her and the feel of the controls in her hands. By the time she was 10, she had logged 48 hours of flight time in a small green logbook that she kept in the front pocket of her backpack, all of it unofficial, all of it carefully recorded. She never told anyone at school. She had tried once, briefly, to explain it to a girl in her class who had asked what she did on weekends, and the explanation had died somewhere in the middle of the second sentence when she had seen the girl's expression become the particular expression of someone who is listening but has stopped understanding. and she had changed the subject and decided that some things were private. At 7:52 a.m., Alaska Airlines Flight 391 began boarding, and Zara gathered her things with the economical efficiency that Wren had taught her was the correct approach to all transitions, neither rushed nor slow, just purposeful, and joined the line forming at Gate B-17. The gate agent, a tall man named Greg who wore his uniform with the slightly rumpled comfort of someone who had been doing this job long enough that the formality had relaxed into something more like a familiar habit, looked at her boarding pass and called her Little Miss, in a tone that was genuinely kind, the kind of kindness that costs nothing and means something, and Zara thanked him and walked down the jetway alone. She found seat 14, a window left side just forward of the wing, stowed her backpack in the overhead bin using both hands because she had to stretch to reach it. Buckled herself in with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom the geometry of aircraft cabins was familiar territory, and pressed her forehead briefly against the cold oval of the window. Below her, the ground crew moved in their fluorescent orange vests, loading bags into the belly of the aircraft, checking the undercarriage panels, waving their orange wands at each other in the specific choreography of airport departure. And she watched them with the attention she gave to all things aviation-related, which was the same quality of attention a musician brings to a performance, not passive observation, but active listening, looking for the things that mattered underneath the things that were merely visible. She thought they think this is routine. She thought about her mother. In the cockpit, Captain Whitmore ran through his pre-flight checklist with the automated fluency of someone for whom this sequence had long since ceased to be a process that required conscious attention and had become instead something closer to muscle memory present, competent, fundamentally absent. He had logged so many pre-flight checks that each individual item registered only at the peripheral edge of his awareness, enough to confirm and proceed, not enough to actually see. He had been flying this aircraft type for 11 years. He knew it the way he knew his own face in the mirror. Daniel Reeves entered the flight plan parameters into the FMS with the slightly deliberate care of a younger pilot who had not yet reached the point where competence had become effortlessness, who still double-checked his own double-checks, who still got a small private satisfaction from watching the departure sequence populate correctly on the display. Neither man said anything unnecessary. The cockpit had the quiet professional atmosphere of two people who knew their jobs and were doing them. Neither of them knew what the ventilation system was already doing. The plane pushed back from the gate at 8:04 a.m., and the flight attendants performed their safety demonstration at the front of the cabin, and Zara watched it without looking up from her book, listening to the specific language around emergency exits and oxygen masks, and brace positions, the way a musician listens to a song they have performed 100 times not for the words, but to notice if anything has changed. Nothing had changed. She turned back to Chapter 9 and kept reading. The carbon monoxide moved through the cockpit ventilation system the way it had been moving for 6 days, odorless, colorless patient, following the ductwork that carried conditioned air from the forward heat exchanger into the space where two men sat at their instruments and breathed. And for the first 40 minutes of the flight, it produced nothing more than a slight heaviness that both men attributed separately and without mentioning it to the early departure time, and the kind of generalized fatigue that accumulates in people who work irregular schedules and do not sleep as well as they once did. The aircraft climbed through 18,000 feet and leveled at cruise altitude. The autopilot engaged with a soft click. The sky outside the windshield was clear and impossibly blue, the kind of blue that exists only above the cloud layer where the atmosphere thins and the light comes from everywhere at once. Below them, somewhere in the distance, the Rocky Mountain Front Range was beginning to resolve out of the haze. At 37,000 feet, somewhere over the Idaho-Montana border, First Officer Daniel Reeves stopped speaking in the middle of a routine altitude report to Denver Center. He had been transmitting their position and heading to the controller on the other end, a clean professional transmission of the kind he made dozens of times per flight, and he got 3 words out. November 74, Alpha, and then simply stopped, the way a piece of music stops when the power goes out without resolution, without warning, without the note that would have made sense of the silence. The controller on the other end, Priya Desai, 34 years old, 6 years at Denver Center, currently working the high-altitude sector over eastern Idaho with the focused competence of someone who had learned to read radio silence the way doctors read vital signs. Waited 1 beat, the standard professional interval, and then said, "Alaska, 391. Say again." Nothing. She tried once more, same calm voice, no urgency in it yet, because urgency in a controller's voice has consequences, and you don't deploy it until you are certain. "Alaska, 391. Denver Center. Radio check." The frequency was dead. She flagged it to her supervisor, Victor Sato, immediately with the particular phrasing that experienced controllers use when they want to communicate seriousness without triggering full emergency protocols before the situation warrants it. Victor walked over and put on a spare headset and listened and understood in approximately 3 seconds what the silence meant, which was that something was wrong in a way that could not yet be categorized but could not be ignored. In the cockpit, Daniel Reeves had slumped sideways in his seat. His left hand had slipped away from the throttle quadrant. His eyes were half open in a way that bore a superficial resemblance to sleep, but was not sleep the body's surrender to something it could not negotiate with. Whitmore lasted 7 more minutes. His larger body, with its greater lung capacity, processing the accumulated gas more slowly. And in those 7 minutes, he became aware gradually, and then all at once, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, that something was catastrophically wrong. He reached toward the radio transmitter. His fingers actually grazed the push-to-talk button. Then his arm fell. He did not lose consciousness immediately. He sat in his seat, aware that he was dying, aware that the aircraft was flying itself on autopilot toward a waypoint he had programmed 40 minutes ago, aware that 222 people were behind him, and aware with a specificity that was almost unbearable that this was a consequence of a decision he had made while sitting in his kitchen calculating whether a repair would conflict with his vacation schedule. The last coherent thought Captain Blake Whitmore had before the darkness took him was not about the 222 people behind him. It was about his vacation. Outside, at 37,000 feet, Alaska Airlines Flight 391 flew on into the clear October morning, the autopilot holding altitude and heading with mechanical indifference. The aircraft, perfectly trim, perfectly stable, moving through the sky with the serene competence of a machine that did not know its crew was gone, and was simply doing what it had been programmed to do. It just flew. If this story moves you, and we believe it will, please subscribe to our channel and stay with us all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. We want to see exactly how far this story travels. Senior flight attendant Gloria Osei had been with the airline for 22 years, and in those 22 years she had handled drunk passengers and medical emergencies, and a bird strike over Memphis that had taken out the number 2 engine and left 140 people absolutely certain they were about to die, and she had handled a college student who had tried to open an emergency exit door mid-flight because he was having a panic attack, and had convinced himself the door was a bathroom. She had held a man's hand while he had a stroke at 30,000 feet, and she had talked a woman through labor in the back galley of a flight from Atlanta to Heathrow. She had seen a great many things in 22 years, and she had learned from all of them to trust her body's first response to situations before her mind had time to rationalize the response away. She was in the forward galley checking the snack cart when the intercom panel behind her clicked twice the particular double click that happened when someone on the flight deck picked up the handset without speaking a routine crew check-in signal, and the silence that followed had a quality to it that she could not describe in words, but understood immediately in her chest. The way you understand certain silences, not as the absence of sound, but as the presence of something that should not be there. She picked up the cabin handset and said in the professional voice she used for communications that needed to be heard clearly and interpreted calmly. "Flight deck. This is the cabin. Do you copy?" "Nothing." She tried again. "Captain Whitmore, we are receiving your signal. Please respond." The silence on the line was wrong in a way she could feel in her molars. She told Tomas Rivera, 26, 3 years, flying, standing at the cart behind her with the slightly stunned alertness of someone who was reading the room and not liking what he was reading to stay where he was. And she walked with the deliberate, unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned that running in a cabin communicated exactly the wrong thing to the forward lavatory, knocked twice on the cockpit door, and used her override code. She opened the door. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, looking at the 2 men slumped in their seats, looking at the instrument panel, glowing green and white and amber. In front of them, looking at the blue morning sky beyond the windshield stretching out in every direction with the complete indifference of something that had no stake in what was happening in the cockpit below it. Then she screamed. It was not a long scream, half a second, maybe less, but it had in it something that traveled through the pressurized aluminum fuselage of that aircraft the way a knife travels through fabric, a sound that cut through everything and left every passenger within 6 rows understanding, without being told anything, that something had gone profoundly, irreversibly wrong. Zara Coleman looked up from Chapter 9 of Stick and Rudder. She had been at the part where Langavisha described the sensation of a properly coordinated turn versus a skidding one, the way the former felt smooth and right, and the latter felt vaguely wrong in a way that pilots sometimes spent their entire careers not being able to articulate, and she had been turning the description over in her mind, trying to find the plain language version that Wren had said would come eventually, when the sound from the front of the aircraft reached her, and she put the plain language project aside and looked up and started watching. She watched the 2 flight attendants rush forward. She watched Tomas Rivera pick up the intercom handset with the jerky urgency of someone whose hands were ahead of his composure. She watched the hushed, tightly controlled crisis forming at the front of the cabin, the way all 3 crew members leaned into each other with the physical language of people sharing information they did not want anyone else to hear. She watched Gloria Osei go through the cockpit door and come out and stand in the aisle with her hand pressed over her mouth, and she watched the expression on Gloria's face. Not fear exactly, but the look of a person who has seen something that cannot be unseen and is now working with everything they have to keep that thing contained. Zara unclipped her seatbelt. She was not afraid. This was the thing she would try to explain later and could never quite find the right words for. She was not afraid, which was not the same as not understanding the severity of what was happening, because she understood it perfectly. She just understood it as a problem to be solved rather than as a situation to be frightened by. And those 2 responses occupied different parts of the brain and produced different outputs. Fear was a weather system that moved in and clouded everything. What Zara felt was clarity, sharp, almost physical, like the sensation of stepping from a dark room into bright sunlight and having everything snap into focus at once. She stood up and walked forward. She was small for her age, and the aisle was cluttered with the ordinary debris of a full aircraft. An armrest someone had left deployed a tray table pulled down and abandoned, and she navigated around both of them without slowing down efficiently and without hurry. The way she moved through flight school corridors and airport terminals and all the other places she had learned to move through without drawing attention to herself. Tomas saw her first. He held up his hand in the automatic gesture of an adult redirecting a child. "Ma'am, miss, you need to return to your seat. We have a—" "Are the pilots incapacitated?" Zara said. The word landed in the air between them and did not behave like a word a child would say. It had the precision of clinical language, the flatness of a professional using a technical term, and it stopped Tomas mid-sentence in a way he could not immediately account for. "Miss, please go back to— Is the autopilot still engaged?" Zara said. Gloria came out of the cockpit and nearly walked into her. "You need to sit down, sweetheart. I know how to fly, Zara said. It was not a boast. It was not a plea. It was information delivered in the same level tone she used when she told Wren she had completed a pre-flight inspection factual useful requiring a response. Not a plane this size. But I know how planes work. I understand aircraft systems. I can hold altitude and I can communicate with the tower. But I need to know right now, is the autopilot on, and what does the FMS show for the next waypoint? Gloria's mouth opened. Closed. She looked at Tomas. Tomas looked at the girl in the navy hoodie with the silver wings on the sleeve standing in the aisle of a 757 at 37,000 feet, asking about the flight management system. The AP light is on, Gloria said slowly, as though feeling her way through the words. The FMS. It says something. Letters. DN. I don't know what that means, Denver Zara said immediately. DN is Denver. That means the autopilot is routing us toward Denver, and the aircraft is going to follow that routing until something changes it or someone tells it to do something different. She exhaled once, a controlled breath, the kind Wren had taught her slow out through the nose before you touch anything. That's actually good. Denver is exactly where we want to be going. She looked at Gloria directly. I need to get in the cockpit. You cannot. Tomas started. Tomas. Gloria's voice was quiet and absolute, the two syllables carrying everything that 22 years of authority in a confined space had taught her about how to end a conversation without raising your volume. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to understand that this was not a discussion. Then she looked at Zara. Something moved across her face. Not surrender exactly, but a specific kind of trust, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from the recognition that the alternative is worse. Let her in, Gloria said. Zara walked through the cockpit door. The first thing she registered was the smell, something chemical faintly sweet. Barely there, but present in the way that things you cannot see are sometimes more present than things you can. She had read about carbon monoxide exposure in the context of aircraft incidents. She had read the NTSB reports. She recognized from the literature she had absorbed across 4 years of studying aviation accidents, with the focused attention of someone who had personal reasons to understand how planes failed the combination of symptoms in front of her, the specific posture of the two slumped figures, the way their bodies had simply yielded to gravity without the resistance of consciousness, and she understood immediately what had happened and what was still happening and what needed to happen next. She moved to the first officer's right seat and sat down in it, which required a slight adjustment, because the seat was sized for a man a foot taller than her, and she looked at the instrument panel in front of her with the concentrated stillness of someone who had spent 4 years studying this panel in textbooks and in the cockpits of small aircraft and in the simulator Wren had taken her to twice, who had memorized the layout and the logic and the underlying principles, who was now seeing the real thing, the actual thing at altitude, with everything in motion for the first time, and was not going to permit herself to be overwhelmed by the gap between the two. The altimeter read 37,200 feet. The airspeed indicator showed 478 knots. The autopilot light was green. The horizon was steady on the attitude indicator. The engines were running at cruise thrust. She assessed each instrument in turn methodically, the way Wren had taught her to scan a panel, not jumping to the alarming thing, but building the complete picture first because the complete picture was always more useful than the one thing that caught your eye. Everything was stable. The aircraft was flying itself correctly. The emergency was not the aircraft. She picked up the radio handset, pressed the push-to-talk button, and spoke. Denver Center. Zara said this is Alaska Airlines Flight 391. I need immediate assistance. Both pilots are incapacitated. My name is Zara Coleman. I am 11 years old. I am in the cockpit and I have flight training in small aircraft. I need someone to talk me through what I need to do. Please respond. She released the button and waited. At Denver Center, Priya Desai was in the middle of coordinating a reroute for a Southwest flight that needed to deviate around weather building over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains when the transmission came through on the Flight 391 frequency, and the sound of it, the steadiness of it, the clarity of it, the complete absence of panic in a voice that had just stated something utterly impossible in the same tone you would use to describe the weather, stopped every process in her brain simultaneously. She sat very still. Around her, without any announcement, without any discussion, the Denver Center sector simply went quiet. Controllers at adjacent positions looked up from their screens. Supervisors turned from their monitors. Someone in the break room doorway stood holding a coffee cup they had forgotten they were holding, and the coffee cup tilted very slightly and the coffee dripped onto the floor, and nobody bent to pick it up. Victor Sato stepped to the supervisor's station, picked up the emergency phone, and said in a voice that was remarkably composed given what his body was doing. Heart rate climbing, hands steady through an act of will, "We have an emergency." "All hands." Priya pressed her push to talk. Her voice was level professional, every syllable landing exactly where she put it. "Alaska, 391. Denver Center copies your transmission. Can you confirm, say again, both pilots are incapacitated?" "Confirmed," Zara said. "I believe it's carbon monoxide poisoning. I can see a sensor fault light on the environmental panel. Both crew members are unconscious and unresponsive. The autopilot is engaged and routing to Denver. I have general aviation training Cessna and Piper, approximately 48 hours total. I have never flown a jet aircraft." There was a pause. Brief, controlled, the pause of someone filing information and making decisions simultaneously. "Copy all. Alaska 391, Priya said. "You are doing great. Do not touch the autopilot. Do not touch anything yet. I am getting someone on the line who is going to help you. Keep talking to me." "Understood," Zara said. One word. No tremor in it anywhere. Earl Hughes had been sitting in the FAA Emergency Coordination Center for 3 hours, doing absolutely nothing in particular when Victor Sato's call came through, and he had been doing nothing because there was nothing to do, which was the nature of volunteer emergency standby work. Long stretches of uneventful presence punctuated by moments that required everything you had, and you never knew which kind of day it was going to be until it was. He was 61 years old and had retired from Delta Airlines 18 months ago after a career that had spanned 31 years and produced 19,000 hours of total flight time, the last 12 of which had been exclusively on the Boeing 757 and 767. He volunteered 2 days a week at the coordination center because his wife had said, not unkindly, but with the specificity of someone who had observed a pattern and named it clearly, that he needed something to do with his hands other than reorganize the garage and reread the same 3 aviation journals. And because he genuinely missed the radio, the specific texture of it, the sound of pilots working, the sense of being part of a system that was keeping people safe. He had not expected to be part of something like this. Victor's briefing was 12 words, 757, both pilots down, 11-year-old girl in the right seat. 48 hours general aviation. Earl picked up the handset. "Alaska, 391, he said, and his voice had in it, even in those 2 words, something that was not performance and was not effort, just the quality of a man who had been exactly who he was for 6 decades and had stopped needing to announce it. "This is Captain Earl Hughes, retired Delta Airlines. I have over 19,000 hours of flight time, including 12 years on the 757. I am not going anywhere. Neither are you. Let's talk." The response came back steady and clear. A girl's voice with the particular quality of a tuning fork, clean and true, and without vibration where vibration should not be. "I'm listening." Earl exhaled. He thought, okay, this one has something. He asked her to read everything she saw on the primary flight display in front of her, starting from the top, like reading from a grocery list, not interpreting, just reading. She did it, and she did it correctly. Values and units and instrument labels. No hesitation, no reaching for words she didn't have. He asked about fuel. She found the quantity indicators on the lower center panel without being told where to look. Left main 42% right, main 44%. Enough, he told her. Do not touch the autopilot. Do not touch the yoke. Do not touch anything. The aircraft is flying itself, and that is exactly what we want. Your job right now is to be my eyes. Then he asked what she had actually flown, and he told her he needed the truth, not the brave version. She answered without hesitating. Cessna 172 43 hours. Piper Cherokee 3 hours. One flight in a Cirrus SR-22 about 20 minutes at the controls during cruise flight. He asked if she understood what happened to a jet aircraft's attitude when the autopilot disengaged at cruise altitude without an active pilot holding the controls. She said it depends on the trim state. If the aircraft is properly trimmed, it should maintain its current attitude for a time. If it isn't trimmed, it could pitch or roll. Earl set down his coffee cup very slowly and looked at Victor Sato, who raised his eyebrows from across the room. "Who taught you that?" Earl said. "My uncle," she said, "and Langavisha. You've read Stick and Rudder." "I'm on my third reading." Earl almost laughed. He caught it. This was not the moment. He said, "Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We are not going to touch the autopilot for a long time, because the autopilot is the most experienced pilot on that aircraft right now, and we are going to let it do its job. What I need you to do is make sure you know where the autopilot disconnect button is, so that if something happens, if the autopilot drops out on its own, you are ready to fly manually. Can you find a red button on the top of the yoke?" A sound of movement, quiet, unhurried. "Found it. Do not press it. Just know where it is. Understood." 19 minutes since first contact. Outside the windows of the FAA Center, the Colorado morning was doing what Colorado mornings did in October, which was to be cold and clear and completely indifferent to everything happening inside the building. Word was moving through the cabin in the way that word always moves through enclosed spaces under pressure, quietly first, then all at once, like a change in weather that you feel before you can see it. Roy Stanton in seat 18. B was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s who carried himself with the unexamined confidence of someone who had spent most of his adult life in rooms where his voice was the loudest and had not yet encountered a situation that required him to recalibrate this. He had heard the scream from the front of the aircraft 12 minutes ago, and he had watched the flight attendant's movements since, and he had developed based on no information at all except his own adrenaline and the expression on Gloria's face when she had said the words, "Technical difficulty," a theory about what was happening, and he had concluded with the complete sincerity of someone who believed that sharing information was always more useful than withholding it, that other people deserved to know this theory. He grabbed Gloria's arm as she passed his row. "The pilot's passed out," he said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear. "That's what you meant. Technical difficulty. There's nobody actually flying this thing." Gloria stopped. She looked at his hand on her arm. She removed it gently, precisely, without drama, and then she looked at him with the expression that 22 years of managing human beings in extreme circumstances had produced in her face, an expression that was not anger and was not judgment, but was something quieter and more absolute than either. "Sir," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear it, "I have 222 people on this aircraft. If you cause a panic in this cabin right now, real people will get hurt. The woman in 22F with the little girl. The man in row 31 who has his hand on his chest right now because his heart is not doing what it should." She held his gaze without blinking. "You can be furious at me when we land. You can sue the airline. But right now you are going to sit down and stay quiet. Do you understand me?" "Roy." Stanton opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved across his face. Not shame exactly, but the first true encounter with something larger than himself and the recognition of it. He sat down. In row 31, Gerald Okafor, 72 years old, silver-haired, wearing the good blazer he had packed specifically because his granddaughter had asked him to look nice for her graduation, sat with his right hand pressed flat against his chest and watched the flight attendants with the careful attention of a man who has lived long enough to know the difference between the faces people wear when everything is fine and the faces they wear when they are working very hard to appear as though everything is fine. In row 22, Patricia Huang had removed her earbuds and was watching the crew's movements with the same focused attention, and what she was reading from those movements was not reassuring her. But she had decided not to share this reading with anyone because the woman beside her had a daughter, perhaps 7 years old, who was currently asleep against her mother's shoulder with the complete trust of a sleeping child, and Patricia Huang had decided that this was worth protecting for as long as possible. Tomas moved through the back rows, doing the job he had been trained to do, keeping his face arranged in the careful expression of a flight attendant, managing a manageable situation, his hands visible and open and unthreatening, his voice low and steady, and completely at odds with the cold water filling his chest that he had been managing since the moment Gloria had opened the cockpit door. But he had seen Gloria's face when she had made the decision to let the girl in, and he had decided that if Gloria believed in something, he was going to believe in it too. 8 minutes after first contact, Zara said, "Captain Hughes, I have an amber caution light on the FMS I haven't seen before. Bottom right of the display. It says VNAV space ALT. At the coordination center, Earl went very still in the specific way of someone who has just received information that requires immediate action and is already taking it while still processing the full implications of it. He knew exactly what the light meant. The aircraft was approaching its programmed altitude constraint for the Denver arrival sequence, and the autopilot was preparing to begin descending, and that descent was programmed for a crew that was actively monitoring it, making real-time adjustments, communicating with air traffic control about the energy state of the aircraft as it came down through the airspace over the mountains. And none of those things were happening. "Zara," he said, keeping the urgency out of his voice, the way you keep water from running over the edge of a very full glass. Carefully, continuously, with constant attention, the autopilot is about to start a descent. That's a normal function of the system, but I need you to do something before it begins. On the mode control panel, the horizontal panel with all the buttons and knobs sitting above the primary flight display in front of you, find the button that says ALT. A pause shorter than he had expected. "I see buttons," she said. HDGSPDALTVSLNAVVNAV. "Perfect. Press ALT. Press it now." A click. A brief silence. The amber light went off, she said. A white light came on. "Good. You just took the aircraft out of the automated descent profile and put it in altitude hold. The plane will maintain 37,000 feet until we tell it to do something different. You just made your first real intervention on a jet aircraft." He paused. "How do you feel?" She was quiet for a moment, a real pause, not hesitation but consideration, and the difference was audible. "Like I need to do the next thing," she said. Earl Hughes thought, yeah, that's a pilot. Roy Stanton had lasted 4 minutes in his seat before deciding that silence was not actually something he was capable of for extended periods under pressure, and he had turned to the man in the seat beside him, a quiet person who had been trying to sleep, and said in the carrying voice that was simply how he spoke, rather than a deliberate choice, "The pilots are unconscious. That's what the flight attendant meant. Technical difficulty. There's nobody at the controls." The man beside him sat up very fast. "What?" The information moved through 3 rows in the time it would have taken Gloria to walk from the galley to row 18, which she was already doing when she heard the first person in row 20 turn to ask the person in row 19 if they had heard what the man up front had said. She moved. She positioned herself between Roy Stanton and the rows behind him, not aggressively, simply occupying the space that needed to be occupied. and she lowered her voice to the register that stopped conversations without raising alarm in the people not intended to hear it. "Sir," she said, "you need to stop talking right now. People have a right to, sir." Her eyes did not move from his. There was nothing in her face that could be interpreted as negotiating. "I have done this job for 22 years. I have been in situations that would have broken most people, and I did not break because I understood every single time that my panic was a luxury I could not afford. Look around this cabin." She did not look away from him. "Every single person you can see is relying on the people in this crew to hold it together. If you take that from them right now, if you replace what little calm remains in this cabin with panic, people will be hurt. Real people. I am asking you as one human being to another to please sit down and stay quiet." Roy Stanton looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the man in 18C who had heard everything and was looking at Roy with an expression of something that was halfway between fear and expectation, as though Roy's next decision was going to determine something for both of them. Roy Stanton sat down. He put both hands flat on his thighs. He stared at the seat back in front of him. He did not speak again. Gloria walked to the forward galley and picked up the PA handset and held it for approximately 3 seconds without speaking, during which she made the internal calculation that she had been making since she had opened the cockpit door. The calculation of what was worse, the rumor or the truth, the half-knowledge spreading through the rows or the full truth delivered in the right voice, and she concluded as she had concluded every other time she had had to make this calculation in 22 years, that people handled truth better than they handled uncertainty, and that the right voice was hers. She pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be direct with you. Our flight crew has been incapacitated by a medical situation. The aircraft is currently on autopilot and is being guided by air traffic control. We have a trained individual working in the cockpit directly with aviation experts on the ground. We are approximately 40 minutes from Denver International Airport, where emergency crews are standing by. I need everyone to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, tray tables up, and seatbacks upright. Follow the instructions of the cabin crew. We are doing everything in our power to bring this aircraft down safely." She set the handset down. For 3 seconds, the cabin was absolutely silent. Then it erupted not into screaming, but into something messier and more human than screaming would have been the sound of 222 people receiving the truth and responding to it with every means available to them. People grabbed each other. Phones came out. A man 2 rows behind the wing started crying, not quietly, not the private kind of crying that people do when they are trying to contain it, but fully with the unashamed force of someone who had been holding something in since the first scream 20 minutes ago and had just been given permission to let it go. A woman in first class reached sideways and took the hand of the complete stranger sitting next to her, a man she had exchanged exactly 4 words with since boarding, and she held it hard enough that her knuckles went white, and the man, to his own surprise, did not pull away. In row 34, a child's voice, very small. "Mommy, is the plane going to crash?" And the mother's voice steadier than she had any right to expect of herself in that moment. The bravest thing she had ever said in her life. "No, baby. We're going to be fine." She did not know if it was true. She said it anyway because that was the only reasonable thing to do, and because her daughter was looking at her the way children look at the people they trust most in the world completely and without reservation, and she was not going to let that look find anything in her face except certainty. In the cockpit, Zara heard the surge of noise through the door muffled by the bulkhead, but present, unmistakable, the collective sound of 222 people confronting their own mortality simultaneously, and she felt it in her sternum like a pressure change, and she understood in a way that was beyond her ears what that sound was, and what it meant, and what it was pressing against. She turned back to the instruments. "Captain Hughes," she said. "They just announced it to the cabin." Eyes forward. Earl said. "The only way you help them is by doing exactly what we're doing right now." "Okay," she said. "Okay." Tomas was working his way through the back rows of the aircraft, moving seat by seat with the focused intentionality of someone doing a job they believe in, especially when the circumstances are making it very difficult. When the woman in seat 31B caught his sleeve and said quietly enough that the child across the aisle could not hear, "He stopped responding about 2 minutes ago. He has a heart condition. I heard him mention it to the person who was sitting here before they moved." The man in 31A was Gerald Okafor, and he was 72 years old, and he was sitting with his right hand pressed flat against his chest, and his breathing shallow and his color wrong in the specific way that Tomas had been trained to recognize and had never seen outside of a training video until this moment. Tomas knelt in the aisle. Sir, can you hear me? I need you to look at me." Gerald turned his head slowly. His eyes were pale brown and frightened and very present. He was entirely conscious, which was both reassuring and concerning, because consciousness meant he was aware of exactly what was happening, and fear was not helping his heart. "Do you have medication with you, nitroglycerin, blood thinners? Anything for your heart?" Gerald managed to nod the smallest possible motion. "Shirt pocket." Another nod. Tomas helped him carefully without rushing, because urgency communicated itself through hands, and Gerald's heart did not need any additional urgency. Eased the small tablet from the pocket and placed it under the man's tongue, and then kept 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist and counted the beats, keeping his face arranged in the composed expression that was his only available contribution to Gerald Okafor's well-being in this moment. The woman in 31B, Patricia Huang, her conference entirely forgotten everything in her life. "Outside this row entirely forgotten," said in a voice that was doing its best. "Is he going to be okay?" "He's going to be okay," Tomas said. And then, because saying things out loud sometimes made them more real, and because he needed this to be true almost as much as Gerald Okafor needed it to be true, "He is going to be okay." Gerald Okafor opened his eyes. They were pale and watery and very frightened and also somehow searching for something specific. "Son," he said barely above a whisper. "Who is flying this plane?" Tomas held the old man's gaze and thought of Gloria's face when she had stepped back from the cockpit door and said, "Let her in," and he felt something settle in his chest that was not certainty but was close enough to function like it. "The best person for the job," he said. Gerald Okafor closed his eyes. His pulse under Tomas's fingers steadied. Earl talked for 4 minutes without stopping, and Zara listened without interrupting, and in those 4 minutes he covered rate of descent and airspeed management and the flap extension sequence, and what each stage of flap extension would feel like through the airframe. The small pitch-up at flaps 5, the slightly more pronounced version at flaps 15 and flaps 30, where the drag would bite in hard and the nose would want to drop and the airspeed would fall quickly, and she needed to be ready for all of it before it happened, rather than discovering it as it happened. He described the gear extension, a large lever on the center console with a wheel-shaped knob, and when she pulled it down, she would hear a deep mechanical rumble traveling up through the seat and into her spine, a sequence of thumps and then 3 green lights on the gear indicator panel. And all of that was correct and expected and meant that the aircraft was doing what it was supposed to do. He described the runway. Runway 17. Left at Denver International, 12,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. And the approach lights that would fill the windshield from altitude and then compact and compress as she got lower. Because Denver sat a mile above sea level and the visual cues on approach were different from what she was used to in small aircraft at lower elevation airports, things would look further away than they were, and then they would look closer very fast, and she needed to know this in advance so that it didn't surprise her. He described the Autoland system on the 757 and the conditions under which it might be used, and what it would and wouldn't do on its own, and he described what she would need to do in the final moments of the approach that no automated system could do for her. At Denver Center, Prisha Desai had cleared a corridor of airspace 40 miles wide on the approach to runway 17 left, rerouting 6 other aircraft, tracking Flight 391 on her scope, with the focused attention of someone managing multiple things simultaneously, while knowing that only one of them was the one that mattered. She was doing math constantly. Fuel burn, ground speed descent, rate timing, the calculations running in the background of her mind, the way they always ran, automatically freeing the front of her mind for everything else. She had a daughter, 8 years old, named Amara. She was thinking about Amara in a way that did not have words. Victor Sato appeared at her shoulder. "How's she doing?" "Steadier than half the actual pilots I've worked," Priya said, without taking her eyes off the scope. Victor nodded. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. 31 minutes after first contact, the cockpit door opened. Zara started to turn. "I'm not staying," Gloria said, already moving, and she was carrying 2 portable oxygen masks from the first aid kit. Adult-sized units designed for passenger medical emergencies, and she had decided this on her own, without asking anyone, without clearing it with the ground team. Because she had understood 10 minutes ago that if there was carbon monoxide residue still present in the cockpit, then the girl in the right seat was being slowly poisoned by the same thing that had taken down the 2 men in the seats in front of her. And Gloria Osei had not spent 22 years in this job to watch that happen without doing something about it. She fit one of the masks to Zara's face. It was too large, designed for an adult sitting loose against the girl's smaller features, and she pressed it to her cheeks and said, "Hold it there with your hand. Breathe through it." Then she moved to the pilots. She checked Whitmore's pulse, first present but weak, the pulse of someone deeply unconscious, then Reeves, whose pulse was stronger, a better sign. She connected both men to the cockpit oxygen outlets behind the pilot seats, fitting the masks to their unconscious faces with hands that were steady, except for a slight tremor that she controlled by moving purposefully and not pausing. "They're both alive," she said. Zara exhaled through the mask. The clear plastic fogged. "Okay. Can you get them on oxygen too? I think you just did." "Thank you." Gloria looked at the girl in the right seat, at the dark eyes steady behind the adult-sized mask, at the small straight shoulders, at the hands resting precisely and without fidgeting at the edge of the console. And she looked at her, the way you look at something you want to memorize, because something in her understood that this was a moment she would carry for the rest of her life, and she wanted to get it right. "I'll be right outside the door," Gloria said. She left the cockpit and pulled the door nearly closed behind her and stood with her back against it facing the forward cabin, and she said a prayer she had not said since she was 12 years old, in a language her grandmother had taught her in words she had not known she still remembered. Lieutenant Commander Ren Coleman, United States Navy, retired, 44 years old, had been sitting in his kitchen in Colorado Springs, drinking his second cup of coffee when the call came from the airline's emergency notification line. A 12-second message automated delivered in the careful, neutral voice of systems designed to communicate urgency without producing panic in the people receiving it, informing him that the unaccompanied minor in Seat 14A of Flight 391 was involved in an onboard emergency and asking him to call back immediately. He had listened to the message. He had sat in his kitchen for 4 seconds, not frozen, not panicking, just processing with the compressed efficiency of someone whose training had taught him that the 4 seconds you spent thinking clearly before acting were almost always worth more than the 4 seconds of earlier action you sacrificed for them. Then he had picked up his car keys and driven. He covered 90 miles in 71 minutes, which was a thing he would not subsequently discuss in the presence of law enforcement, and he walked through the door of the FAA Emergency Coordination Center with the particular quality of presence that former military personnel carry in their bodies even after the uniform is gone. Straight-backed, unhurried. completely certain of his right to be wherever he was standing. Victor Sato looked up. Wren held up one hand, not aggressive, just definitive. "I'm Zara's uncle, naval aviator. 1,400 hours, fixed wing 400 rotary. I taught her everything she knows about flying. Tell me what she doesn't know, and I will fill it in right now." Victor looked at him for 2 seconds, the look of a man who was evaluating quickly and accurately. Then he pointed at the empty chair beside Earl Hughes. Wren sat down. Earl put a spare headset in front of him. Wren put it on. He heard his niece's voice on the frequency, steady, precise reading instrument values to Priya Desai, with the clipped exact cadence he had spent 4 years teaching her, the cadence of someone who understood that in an aircraft imprecise communication was a form of danger. And something moved across his face that Earl Hughes, who was watching from the corner of his eye, recognized as something he did not have a name for, but understood completely because it contained grief and pride and terror and love all at once compressed into a single expression that lasted perhaps a second before Wren replaced it with the face of a man who had things to do. "What does she not know?" Earl asked quietly. "She's never flared a jet," Wren said. His voice was professional, factual, building the briefing efficiently. "In a Cessna or a Cherokee, the flare is intuitive. She knows it. It's in her hands. In a 757, if she pulls back the way she does in a small plane on short final, she'll balloon the aircraft. Too much back pressure too soon, and the landing becomes something else." "I'll talk her through it," Earl said. "I'll talk her through it," Wren said. He did not say it as a challenge or a correction. He said it with the simple certainty of someone stating a fact about themselves. "She knows my voice. When it gets close, she needs to hear my voice." Earl looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded and stepped back from the primary frequency. 22 minutes from Denver at 31,000 feet, and descending, the aircraft shuddered. It was not a violent shudder, more like a single deep pulse through the airframe lasting perhaps 2 seconds. The kind of movement that in any other context would have been logged as mild turbulence and forgotten before the seatbelt sign was turned off. But at 31,000 feet in a jet aircraft with no active pilot crew, 2 seconds of unexplained vibration occupies a completely different category of experience. And Zara's hands went to the yoke without any conscious decision involved. Pure trained instinct, the reflex her uncle had drilled into her across dozens of flights and hundreds of hours of study. And she felt the controls in her palms for exactly 1 second before she caught herself, recognized the instinct for what it was, and pulled her hands back. "Captain Hughes," she said, and her voice was as flat and even as it had been for the past 30 minutes, with no acknowledgement that anything had changed. I felt a vibration. Duration, approximately 2 seconds. No change in instruments that I can see. No warning lights. Earl was already talking to the technical representative from the airline who had been patched into the line, a man named Phil Garrett with 20 years of 757 systems experience, and the specific kind of dry, relentless competence that you wanted in the room when something unexpected was happening and Phil said off Zara's frequency, "Wake turbulence from the traffic we rerouted 20 minutes ago. Most likely tell her to watch the engine instruments, N1 and N2 and EGT. If those are stable, we're fine." Zara Earl said, "I need you to look at the engine instruments. There should be 2 sets, 1 for each engine. Tell me what you see." She looked. She read them back, both engines. Nominal thrust parameters, stable temperature within limits. "We're fine," Earl said. "That was turbulence, and you handled it exactly right. You went for the yoke. Your instincts told you to take control, and then your training told you to stop, and you listened to your training. That's the right sequence. That's exactly right." A brief silence. "It won't happen again," she said, meaning the reaching, not the turbulence. And Earl understood this and did not correct the shorthand. In the cabin, the shutter had passed through 222 people, like a current through water, brief and complete, and leaving no one untouched by it. The man in 17C, who had been praying silently, opened his eyes. The woman who had taken a stranger's hand tightened her grip. Roy Stanton, in 18B, sat perfectly still, hands flat on his thighs, not speaking, not looking at anyone, his earlier certainty about his own right to fill silences thoroughly and permanently replaced by something quieter and more appropriate to the moment. Alaska, 391. Priya said, "Descend and maintain flight level 240. I need you to select the altitude on the mode control panel and dial it to 24,000, then press Alt-Cell." Zara had been studying the mode control panel for the past 8 minutes, not because she needed to look at it to find things, but because she was the kind of person who used quiet moments to prepare for the moments that wouldn't be quiet, and she had identified every knob and button on the panel by position and label, so that when she was asked to use one, she could find it without having to search. She found the altitude selector. She dialed it. She pressed the button. The nose of the aircraft tilted forward gently, barely perceptible, but she felt it a slight relaxation in the aircraft's attitude. The autopilot capturing the new target and beginning the process of descending toward it with the calm mechanical certainty of a system that did not experience doubt. Vertical speed showing 900 feet per minute down, she reported. "Perfect," Priya said. "That's exactly what we want. You're doing great." Then the frequency shifted. "Hey, kid." The voice was different from Earl's, not older, but more personal, carrying something in it that was not professionalism, but something under professionalism. The particular frequency that exists between two people who have shared a very specific kind of time together, who have been in small cockpits in bad weather and come out the other side still talking. 3 seconds of silence on the frequency. Not hesitation, not shock. Just the moment of adjustment required when you have been carrying something alone for a long time and someone else suddenly puts their hand on the other side of it. "Uncle Ren," she said. Not a question. Not a cry of relief. Just his name said the way you say the name of someone you trust completely when they arrive at the exact moment you needed them to arrive, which is to say with everything in it, and none of it visible on the surface. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. A breath. How did you—" "Doesn't matter right now. We've got about 12 minutes, and I need to talk to you about the flare because landing a jet is different from anything you've done, and I need you to know exactly how before we get there. Are you listening?" "Listening," she said. Ren did not say different from anything you've ever done because that framing would have put the weight of the unknown squarely in front of her, and he was not going to do that. He said landing a jet is different from the Cherokee, which was true and specific and comparative rather than absolute, framing the new knowledge as a modification of existing knowledge rather than a replacement of it. "The flare happens later than you think," he said. "In the Cherokee, you start pulling back when the runway feels close. In this aircraft, when the runway feels close, you wait because Denver sits a mile higher than sea level and the visual cues compress and things arrive at your windshield faster than you expect. If you pull when the Cherokee tells you to pull, you'll be too early." "How late?" she said. "I'll tell you when," he said. "I'll be counting you down. When I say, now, that's when." "Okay. And when I say now, the back pressure I need from you is the gentlest thing you have ever put on a control. We're talking about—" He paused, and she could almost hear him searching for the right words, the right image, the one that would land in exactly the right place like holding a bird. "Do you remember what I told you?" She remembered. He had said it to her when she was 9 years old and over-controlling on her first crosswind landing in the Cessna. Hands too tight. Inputs too large, the aircraft sliding sideways because she was fighting it instead of guiding it. And he had said, hold the controls like you're holding a bird, firm enough that it can't escape, gentle enough that you don't crush it. "Like holding a bird," she said. "Exactly like that," he said. His voice didn't crack. He made sure of it she could hear the care he was taking, and she recognized it because she had heard him take that same care in other cockpits in other difficult moments, and she had always found it reassuring, rather than alarming, the evidence of someone paying full attention to what mattered. 11 minutes to Denver. In the descent, the Rocky Mountain Front Range was becoming visible below the aircraft, the long white edge of the Continental Divide. The plains spreading east from its base, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the specific arrangement of runways and lights and emergency vehicles that was Denver International Airport, where 2 fire trucks and 4 ambulances were already positioned at the side of runway 17 left, and where a woman named Sandra Mwangi from the FAA was standing in the operations center watching a radar scope with the contained, steady attention of someone who had already assembled the first elements of an investigation that was going to take months and produce consequences that would travel well beyond this day. Her right hand started to shake. Not much, not enough that anyone watching would have noticed. Not a visible tremor, but something subtler felt, rather than seen, a fine vibration in the fingers she had been pressing against the edge of the center console for the past 40 minutes without realizing she was doing it, gripping the same surface with the sustained, unconscious tension of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a long time. She noticed it the way you notice a crack in a wall, not because it appeared suddenly, but because you finally looked directly at the thing you had been peripherally aware of all along. She pressed her hand flat against her thigh and held it there for 3 seconds, and the tremor stopped absorbed by the firmness of contact, and she moved her hand back to the console and did not mention it to Earl or to Wren because there was nothing useful to say about it, and several useful things to say about other things instead. What she said was, "When the flaps extend to 30 degrees, if I'm slightly slow on the back pressure, how much will the nose drop before the autopilot compensates? Because I want to know the exact number so I don't overcorrect." On the other end of the line, Earl Hughes made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the specific exhalation of a man who has just been reminded of the thing he loved most about aviation, which is that it selected for a particular kind of mind, precise and curious and unable to leave an unanswered question alone. And here was that mind in an 11-year-old girl at 28,000 feet, asking him for exact numbers because she was not going to guess when precision was available. He gave her the exact numbers. He described the pitch response at each flap setting with the specificity she was asking for, and she absorbed every number without asking him to repeat anything, filing it in the same place. She filed everything completely permanently available on demand. In the cabin behind her, the aircraft had reached a quality of collective silence that was different from the panicked eruptions of earlier. This was the quiet of people who had run through every version of the next few minutes that their minds could produce and had arrived by different routes at the same destination, which was the complete surrender of control to someone else, and the recognition that this surrender was the only thing left available to them. The man in 17C had stopped praying with his lips and started praying some other way, the way you pray, when words stop being the point. The woman who had taken the stranger's hand had been holding it for 35 minutes, and the stranger had fallen asleep or something close enough to sleep that it didn't matter, and she had not let go. Patricia Huang had her eyes closed. She was not praying. She was composing the exact words she was going to say to her daughter the moment she stepped off this aircraft. The words she should have said the morning she left, but hadn't, because they had argued about something so small she could no longer remember what it was, and she was certain she was going to get off this aircraft. Certain in a way she could not explain or justify, but also could not shake, and she was using that certainty to construct sentences that were going to matter. The worn copy of Stick and Rudder sat in the seat-back pocket of 14A halfway out, leaning against the tray table latch, the dog-eared pages fanning slightly in the recycled air of the cabin. Nobody noticed it. In about 90 seconds, Zara said, "I need to disengage the autopilot and fly this aircraft manually to the runway." The cabin behind the cockpit door was the quietest it had been since the aircraft left Seattle. Not silent, because 222 people in an enclosed, pressurized space cannot produce silence, but quiet, with the specific quality of held breath, the hush that settles over a room when something irreversible is about to be decided. "You're ready for that?" Wren said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud first." There was a pause, brief, genuine. "Your mother used to do that," Wren said. "Before a new maneuver, she'd say it out loud first. She said it made it real before it was real." "I know," Zara said softly. "She told me." Wren's voice dropped, not lower in volume, but lower in register. The way voices drop when they stop being professional and start being personal, when what is being said has no technical purpose and is being said anyway because it needs to be said. "Your mother flew into headwinds that would have broken anyone else," he said. "Not because she wasn't afraid of them. She was afraid sometimes. She told me once that the thing she was most afraid of was not the aircraft. It was the moment before she knew whether she was good enough. And then the moment would come and she would find out that she was, and she would file that away, and the next time the fear would be a little smaller." Zara was quiet. "You know the difference," Wren said, "between the airplane telling you it's afraid and the airplane telling you something is actually wrong. You have always known that difference. I watched you learn it. I watched you stop confusing the two things." A pause. "Now disengage the autopilot and fly this aircraft." Zara reached up. She found the red button on the top of the yoke. She knew exactly where it was, had known where it was since Earl had asked her to find it 42 minutes ago, and she pressed it. The autopilot disconnect alarm sounded 2 sharp tones, clean and definitive, and then the aircraft was hers. She felt it immediately, felt it the way you feel something you have been anticipating for a long time, which is always more than you expected and also exactly what you expected, both things at once. The live weight of the yoke in her hands, the way the aircraft breathed and adjusted and pushed back against her inputs, the particular aliveness of something very large that is responding to the pressure of your palms and the angle of your wrists and the decisions your nervous system is making faster than your conscious mind can track. Nothing like the simulator, nothing like the Cessna, enormous and alive, and completely indifferent to the fact that she was 11 years old. "I have the aircraft," she said. "Flaps. 5, Wren said. She found the flap lever and extended it to the first position, and the aircraft responded precisely as described, a brief, gentle buffet through the airframe. Barely a shudder, the nose pitching up a fraction of a degree as the increased lift tried to climb, and the autopilot no. She reminded herself she was the autopilot now as she held the attitude steady with back pressure that was automatic and correct before she had consciously decided to apply it. Flaps 15. More buffet. More pitch. The airspeed needle moving back through 180 knots. The aircraft slowing into its approach configuration with the deliberate, measured quality of something that was designed to do exactly this and was doing it well. The altimeter unwound through 8,000 feet. Through 7,500. The ground below was no longer abstract. She could see the grid of streets and lights that meant city, and beyond it the flat geometrical expanse of the airport runway markers, visible even from this altitude, if you knew what to look for. "Gear down," Wren said. She found the large lever on the center console wheel-shaped knob exactly as described and pulled it down. The sound hit her before the feeling did, a deep mechanical rumble traveling up through the aircraft's structure, through the seat, through her spine. A sequence of thumps that were substantial enough to feel like something going wrong if you hadn't been told exactly what to expect. And because she had been told exactly what to expect, she recognized it correctly. The main landing gear deploying, dropping down and locking into position 30 feet below where she was sitting. 3 green lights appeared on the gear indicator panel. 3 green, she said. "Gear down and locked." "Good," Wren said. "Flaps 30, she extended. The wall of air arrived exactly as described. The drag biting in with sudden authority, the nose dropping, the airspeed crashing back through 145 knots. the aircraft's whole character changing as it transformed from a cruise configuration into a landing configuration, slower and lower and committed now to what was coming. She had back pressure on the yoke already instinctive and correctly calibrated, holding the nose from dropping too far, maintaining the approach attitude that would keep her on the glide path. "You're at 600 feet, Priya said. "Runway in sight. You are on the center line. You are doing perfect." She was not doing perfect. She was doing something that had the structure of correct and the intention of correct, but contained in its execution the small imprecisions of someone flying this aircraft for the first time a touch left of centerline, the aircraft drifting in the crosswind that was pushing across runway 17. Left at 13 knots from the northwest, and a small overcorrection to the right that took her a half-second longer to catch than it should have. She felt the drift. She applied right aileron carefully, the minimum input required, and the aircraft came back toward the center line, and she caught it before it overcorrected, and she was back on track, and the correction had taken perhaps 3 seconds total, but had felt longer from inside it, from inside the particular density of 3 seconds when everything is moving at once, and the ground is coming up faster than the visual system is prepared for. 500 feet, Priya said. Steady, professional. The voice of someone who had been managing this approach for the past 20 minutes and was going to manage it all the way to the ground. 400. 300. Zara. Wren's voice quieter now, closer, the specific register he used when they were in a cockpit together, and he was telling her something that had nothing to do with the checklist and everything to do with what she was made of. "When I say now, the gentlest back pressure you have ever put on a control. Like you're holding a bird. 200 feet. The runway lights were filling the windshield, the approach light array resolving out of the Denver haze closer and brighter with every second, and the runway itself visible beyond them, long and wide and absolutely real in a way that the runway in every simulator and every small plane landing had never quite been. Because this was the real thing. This was the ground. These were 222 people, and this was the only landing she was going to get. 150, Priya said. Now Wren said. She pulled. She pulled the way you breathe out when you are trying not to wake someone sleeping on the other side of a door slowly, with complete control, the minimum effort required and not a fraction more. The nose rose 2 degrees, which was exactly right, which was the precise angle that converted the aircraft's forward momentum into the brief, suspended moment of the flare, the moment between flying and landing, when the aircraft is neither fully one thing nor fully the other. The main gear kissed the runway. Left first, then right, a double thump that traveled up through the landing gear and through the fuselage and through the seat and into her spine and her hands and her sternum, a feeling that was nothing like anything she had experienced before and exactly like what it was supposed to be. The nose wheel came forward and touched, and the thrust reversers deployed with a roar that filled the cockpit and rattled the windows and was the loudest thing she had heard in the past hour, and the runway that had been rushing toward her at 140 knots was now passing beneath her and flowing behind her, and the aircraft was slowing, still slowing, and then not moving. Zara released the yoke. She placed both hands in her lap, palms down, fingers flat, and she looked at the runway centerline painted on the concrete 25 feet ahead of her, and she breathed one long, slow breath in through the oxygen mask, the plastic fogging and clearing and then out, and she held the out-breath for a moment before the next one came, and she did not cry, and she did not scream, and she did not say anything at all for what felt like a long time, and was probably 6 seconds. Then Wren's voice came through the headset. It was the only moment in the entire flight across every checklist, every instruction, every steady professional transmission, when his voice broke slightly at the edge of a word, and the word was her name. Zara. She pressed push to talk. Her voice was steady. "I've got the aircraft stopped," she said. "Both engines still running. I didn't know the shutdown procedure. Where do I go from here? At Denver Center. Priya Desai pressed her push-to-talk button and discovered to her complete surprise that she could not immediately speak. She put her hand over her mouth for 2 seconds, not to cover emotion she would have said if anyone had asked, but to give herself the moment required to assemble language from what was currently in her chest, and then she removed her hand, and her voice was steady when it came. Alaska, 391, she said. Welcome to Denver. A pause, 1 beat deliberate. Follow the emergency vehicles to the gate. Another pause. And Zara, that was one of the finest approaches I have ever worked in my career. Outside the cockpit windows, the first fire truck was rolling alongside the aircraft, its lights painting red and white patterns across the tarmac in the morning light, and behind the cockpit door, 222 people were beginning slowly, incompletely, each at their own pace, to understand that they were alive. The first paramedic through the cockpit door was 27 years old and had been on the airport emergency unit for 4 years and had been briefed 3 separate times on exactly what to expect when he boarded this aircraft, which was 2 incapacitated pilots, possible carbon monoxide poisoning, and an unaccompanied minor in the right seat. He stopped in the cockpit doorway and looked at the girl in the right seat. Small, dark-haired, and adult-sized oxygen mask pressed to her face with one hand, the other hand resting in her lap. Both engines still running at idle. The entire instrument panel glowing in front of her in the specific way that cockpit instrument panels glow, which is to say with the complete serene authority of systems that are doing their jobs correctly and don't care what else is happening, and he stood there for a moment, unable to move because the image in front of him did not correspond to any category his brain had prepared for it. Zara turned and looked at him over her shoulder. "Engines are still running," she said. "I didn't know the shutdown procedure." He stepped forward. He said very carefully with the deliberate calm of someone working hard to match the register of the person they were speaking to. "That's okay. We'll handle that." He reached past her for the radio. "Are you hurt? Any dizziness?" "Headache. Mild headache," she said. "I've been on portable oxygen for about 35 minutes. He worked fast through the pilot's pulse checks, airway assessments, calling back through the door to his partner, then returned to Zara. "I need you to come with me now." She did not move immediately. She looked at the instrument panel one final time, the altimeter showing Denver's elevation. 5,431 feet. The engines at idle, all systems stable. The aircraft doing what it was always supposed to do, carrying people safely from one place to another. And she put her right hand flat on the center console for exactly 1 second, the way you would touch the shoulder of someone who had helped you through something genuinely difficult and you wanted them to know you understood what they had done. Then she stood up. She was small. The paramedic kept coming back to this later when people asked him about that day. He would always start with this: the fact that when she stood up she barely reached the tops of the seat backs, that the cockpit that had seemed sized correctly when he entered it suddenly seemed very large around her. She walked through the cockpit door and into the forward cabin. The aircraft went silent. Not gradually. All at once, the way a room goes silent when something happens that stops everyone mid-thought. 4 full seconds of complete suspended silence. 222 people looking at an 11-year-old girl walk out of the cockpit, holding an oxygen mask in both hands, wearing a faded navy blue hoodie with silver embroidered wings on the left sleeve, her dark eyes moving across the rows with the steady, slightly surprised expression of someone who was not prepared for what they were seeing. Then the man in 17C, the one who had been praying with his lips moving and his hands locked on the armrests for the past 40 minutes, who had prayed the same word over and over and over until the word had stopped being a word and had become simply the rhythm of his fear, started to clap. He did it the way people applaud when words are not sufficient and their body needs to do something with what it is carrying, which is hard and loud and shaking and not particularly graceful. His hands came together and the sound rang out in the cabin, and the woman in 22F joined him immediately, and Roy Stanton in 18B brought his hands together hard. The hands that had been flat on his thighs for the past 20 minutes, the hands that had grabbed Gloria's arm and been gently removed, and they were shaking, and he let them shake. Tomas started clapping from the back galley and had to stop after 4 beats, because he was crying too hard to do both at the same time, and this was fine, this was correct, and he did not apologize for it. Every person on Alaska Airlines Flight 391, all 222 of them, was applauding. Some of them were standing. Some were holding each other. Some were doing both simultaneously and not managing either one particularly well. The sound filled the cabin the way light fills a room when every curtain is opened at the same moment, suddenly completely with a brightness that made it impossible to see anything clearly. For a moment, everything washed out and overwhelming, and then slowly resolving back into the familiar shapes of things. Zara stood in the aisle and held the oxygen mask in both hands and looked at the faces. Looking at her, and her own face moved through something that started as composure and passed through surprise and arrived somewhere near the edge of tears, which she did not let fall, because she was still in the middle of something, and she did not cry in the middle of things, and she had learned this from her mother, who had said once that you finished first and felt later, and that was the correct order. Gloria put her arm around Zara's shoulders. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with her arm around the girl, and that was enough, and they both understood that it was enough, and the applause continued, and outside the windows of the aircraft, the Denver morning was doing what it always did, which was to be clear and cold and indifferent and magnificent. Ren Coleman had been standing at the gate door for 7 minutes without moving. He had not paced. He had not checked his phone. He had stood in the specific way that people who have spent years waiting for aircraft in difficult circumstances know how to stand, wait. Balanced breathing controlled the body, arranged in a position that could be maintained indefinitely because movement was not going to help anything. And stillness, at least, was honest. When the gate door opened and Zara came through, he crossed the distance between them in 4 steps. He put his arms around her and held on, and she pressed her face against his jacket, the worn canvas flight jacket he had been wearing since Colorado Springs, the one that smelled like aviation fuel and the particular soap he had used for as long as she could remember, and she made no sound, but her hands found the back of his jacket and gripped the fabric with a force that communicated everything the silence was covering. He held her for a long time. Neither of them said anything. The airport operations staff and the 2 security personnel standing in the jetway turned slightly away, finding things to look at that were not the man and the girl holding each other, because some moments are private, even when they happen in public, and the right response to them is to give them the space they need. Finally, Ren pulled back and held her face in both hands and looked at her eyes, checking the way he always checked the way aviators check things, systematically, starting with the most critical, and she let him look because she understood what the looking was. "Headache?" he asked. "Yes." "Vision fine." "Hospital." "I know." He nodded. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they walked together toward the medical team waiting at the end of the jetway, and behind them the gate door closed, and inside the aircraft 222 people were beginning the process of disembarking into a world that was exactly the same as the world they had left in Seattle that morning, and also in some way that none of them yet had language for completely different. Derek Albright had been VP of operations for the airline for 6 years. And in 6 years, he had developed a finely tuned professional instinct for the difference between situations that required genuine accountability and situations that required managed messaging, and his instinct upon receiving the first briefing about Flight 391, while sitting in a Seattle conference room that smelled of stale coffee and recent anxiety, was that this was primarily the second kind of situation with some elements of the first that would need to be carefully handled. He was in his early 50s, with the kind of blonde hair that had not so much grayed as solidified, fixed and maintained with the consistency of someone for whom appearance was a professional tool, and he wore his suit with the authority of someone who understood that clothing communicated before words did. He arrived at Denver International with 2 lawyers and a media coordinator before Zara Coleman had reached the hospital, which was, by his calculation, exactly when he needed to arrive. His strategy was straightforward. Position the airline as having responded to an extraordinary situation with the robustness of its emergency protocols, emphasize the successful outcome, express regret for the inconvenience, and keep the conversation as far as possible from the maintenance records of the specific aircraft involved, which he had been informed by one of the lawyers contained certain irregularities that would require careful handling. He gave a statement to the reporter who caught him in the corridor outside the operations center, smooth and prepared and carefully calibrated, describing the incident as a remarkable situation, handled through the airline's well-established emergency response systems, praising the cabin crew by role rather than by name, and giving Zara Coleman no acknowledgement whatsoever. Not a name, not a description, not a single word that might direct public attention toward the fact that an 11-year-old girl had done the thing that his airline's protocols had failed to provide for. The statement landed online within minutes. It was clipped and shared immediately. By the time Albright reached his prepared comments about the airline's commitment to passenger safety, the response was already forming, and it was not the response he had prepared for. The airline is taking credit for what a child did. This was the sentence that appeared most often in hundreds of variations in the first hour. The airline's stock began moving in the wrong direction. Albright's phone started ringing with calls he did not want to take. Inside a hospital room on the 4th floor of Denver Health, Zara Coleman did not yet know any of this. Blake Whitmore woke in a hospital room at 2:17 in the afternoon to the sound of cardiac monitoring equipment and the particular quality of light that comes through hospital curtains in the middle of the day, diffuse institutional, the light of a room where time moves differently than it does outside. He was disoriented for approximately 4 seconds, the way people are disoriented when they regain consciousness in unfamiliar surroundings, and then the disorientation cleared, and what replaced it was not confusion, but the specific weighted clarity of someone who has been unconscious and is now remembering in sequence the things that led to the unconsciousness. A nurse appeared and explained what had happened in the careful, neutral way of someone who had been instructed to provide information without providing judgment, and Whitmore absorbed the information with the stillness of a man who already understood most of it and was filling in the remaining gaps. A television was on in the corner, volume low. The news crawler at the bottom of the screen read, 11-year-old lands commercial jet at Denver after both pilots collapse. 222 passengers safe. He read the number 222 and could not look away from it. FAA investigator. Sandra Mwangi arrived at 3:04 p.m. She was 42 years old, precisely dressed, and she carried herself with the economy of someone who had learned that stillness communicated more authority than movement. She set a folder on the bedside table without opening it. She did not sit down. She told him what the investigation had already found: the maintenance work order for the carbon monoxide sensor filed on October 5th and removed from the active queue on October 9th under his signature marked as a non-critical deferral. The repair budget allocated to the fix that had been diverted, the 3 prior maintenance discrepancy reports in his personnel file from the past 4 years, 2 of which had been closed with paperwork irregularities that had never been formally addressed. She delivered this information in the same tone throughout, steady, factual, without inflection. Then she told him about the 4 other aircraft. She watched his face when she said this: 4 other aircraft in the fleet with the same faulty sensor, all flagged in maintenance reports, 2 of them carrying passengers in the air. At the moment, Flight 391 touched down in Denver, both diverted and grounded within hours of Zara's landing. She reached into the folder and placed one document on the bedside table beside him, a printed copy of the ATC audio transcript from the flight. Zara's transmissions transcribed word for word, starting with the first call. Denver Center. This is Alaska Airlines Flight 391. I need immediate assistance and running through to the final transmission after touchdown. She said, "When you are medically cleared, Mr. Whitmore, there will be a formal proceeding. I strongly suggest you contact an attorney." She picked up the folder. "There is one other thing." A pause. "The girl who landed your aircraft. She asked this morning whether you were expected to recover. She said she hoped you were okay." Sandra Mwangi looked at him directly without expression. "I thought you should know that." She left. Whitmore picked up the transcript. His hands were steady through the first page. They were not steady through the second. When he reached the line, "My name is Zara Coleman. I am 11 years old. I am in the cockpit and I know how to fly." He set the transcript face down on the blanket covering his legs and looked at the curtained window for a long time without speaking. Outside, Denver was moving into afternoon. In a room 3 floors up, an 11-year-old girl with elevated carbon monoxide levels and a mild headache was talking to her father, who had flown through the night to reach her, and telling him the story of what had happened in the order in which it had happened, with the same precision and completeness she brought to everything she put her attention on. The NTSB preliminary finding went public at 3:47 p.m. It was 8 paragraphs long, and it was not written to be alarming. Federal aviation documents rarely are, but its content was alarming regardless of how it was written, because what it said in the careful language of regulatory investigation was that the carbon monoxide sensor on Flight 391 had not been the only malfunctioning unit in the airline's fleet. There were 4 others. All 4 had been flagged in maintenance reports. 2 of the 4 had been in active service with passengers aboard at the moment Zara Coleman brought Flight 391 to the ground at Denver International. Both had been diverted. Both had landed without incident. The sensors had been replaced on the ground within an hour of the findings' release. The fact of it landed in the afternoon news cycle with the weight of a second impact, because it shifted the story from a single act of negligence by a single individual into something with a wider shape, a pattern of decisions made across a maintenance division, a culture where certain kinds of safety reports were treated as administrative inconveniences rather than operational imperatives, where the schedule and the budget consistently outranked the mechanisms that existed specifically to prevent what had nearly happened at 37,000 feet that morning. Derek Albright's carefully built narrative collapsed in real time. His statement about the airline's robust emergency protocols was being played side by side with the NTSB findings on every network before the afternoon was over, and the contrast was not survivable as a communications strategy. Zara heard about it from Wren, who showed her the news on his phone without comment, and let her read it herself, because he had learned years ago that she preferred information straight and did not need it pre-processed. She read it twice, set the phone down. 4 more, she said. They caught it because of yesterday, Wren said. She was quiet for a moment, because Gloria opened the cockpit door. If she hadn't, if the investigation had started from outside rather than from inside the aircraft, they might not have looked as hard at the maintenance records. A pause. People need to know that part. It's not just about what I did. It's about what she did first. She picked up her phone and sent a message to the reporter Sandra Mwangi had mentioned a man named Webb who covered aviation, whose number Sandra had passed along with a note that said, simply, "He is trustworthy," and the message said, "The 4 other aircraft is the real story." Gloria Osei opened the cockpit door. "That's why they found them." "Can we talk?" Webb replied in 30 seconds. "Yes." Dr. James Coleman arrived at 8:47 a.m. the following morning, which meant he had gotten on a plane. The red-eye, the first available approximately 40 minutes after Wren had called him, and he had spent the flight in the specific agony of someone who knew exactly what was happening and was several thousand miles from it, unable to do anything except sit in a seat and wait for the distance to close. He came through the hospital room door carrying the evidence of that agony on him, the way people carry long nights. Jacket thrown over a shirt he'd slept in. Reading glasses pushed into his hair. The particular tightness around his eyes of someone whose face has been doing difficult things for many hours and has not quite recovered its default expression. He stopped in the doorway. Zara was sitting up in the hospital bed with the IV port taped to her left arm and stick and rudder open in her lap. Tomas had found it in the seatback pocket of 14A after the aircraft was cleared and had driven to the hospital himself to return it, a gesture that had made Zara look at the book for a moment before she set it on the tray table and said, "Thank you," in the quiet way she said things that mattered. Her father looked at her with everything he had been carrying since the phone call, and it was a great deal, and none of it had language yet. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and put his arms around her, and she put her arms around him, and it was different from how Wren had held her on the jet bridge. Wren's embrace had been relief and restraint and love all compressed together, the embrace of someone who loved her and had also spent years teaching her to handle things alone, and was reckoning with both of those facts simultaneously. Her father's embrace was just complete. The particular fit of it that had not changed since she was small. "I need you to know," he said when he finally pulled back, his voice unsteady in the way that voices are unsteady when they are carrying more than they were designed for, "that I am so proud of you that I cannot hold it. I have been trying to hold it since Kenji called, and I cannot." He started to say Diane's name. He stopped. "I know, Dad," Zara said quietly. She would have. He pressed his forehead briefly against hers. Then he straightened, cleaned his glasses on his jacket the way he always did when his hands needed something to do, and put them back. "Okay," he said. "Tell me everything." She told him everything from the scream to the 3 green lights to the moment she released the yoke, and she told it in the order it happened with the precision she brought to all accounts of things that mattered. And her father listened to every word without interrupting. And by the time she reached the end, his face had completed whatever complicated transit it had been making since he walked through the door, and had arrived at something that was not quite calm, but was close enough to function like it. Sandra Mwangi arrived at the hospital room at 10:15 a.m., and she sat in the chair that Wren vacated for her with the contained, direct attention of a federal aviation professional who had spent 20 years evaluating the intersection of human performance and mechanical systems, and had developed from that work a complete absence of sentiment about her job combined with a very deep respect for competence wherever she found it. "What you did yesterday," she said, "will be in FA training materials within the year. The radio transcript, the approach, the decision-making under pressure. It will be studied by everyone who trains controllers and everyone who trains pilots for a very long time." She paused. "That's not why I'm here." "Okay," Zara said. "I'm here because there are regulatory questions that need to be addressed. Specifically the question of your having operated a certificated commercial aircraft without appropriate certification." She opened the folder. "I want to be very clear about how the FAA views this situation. We view it as a life-saving emergency action by a minor, with demonstrable training and exceptional performance under extreme conditions. The administrator has reviewed the transcript personally. There will be no enforcement action. That is final." James Coleman released a breath he had been holding since Sandra Mwangi walked through the door. "Thank you," Zara said. "Don't thank me yet," Sandra said. "I'm also here to tell you that the FAA would like to explore an accelerated pathway for your formal certification. You have documented flight time, documented training, and a performance record that is—" she chose her words carefully, the way she chose all words unprecedented in my experience. "There are mechanisms within federal aviation regulations for exceptional young aviators. We would like to begin that conversation whenever you feel ready." Zara looked at her father. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who knew exactly what she was going to say and was prepared to stand behind it. She turned back to Sandra Mwangi. "I want to earn the certificate," she said. "Not because of yesterday, because I actually want to be a pilot, and a pilot earns it." Sandra Mwangi looked at her for a long moment, the direct, unornamented assessment of someone who spent her professional life reading people. Then she nodded once. It was not performative. It was the nod of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected was true. That she said is exactly what I expected you to say, and that is exactly what we will do. She left her card on the tray table and showed herself out. James Coleman said quietly into the silence she left behind, "Your mother would have said the same thing." Zara looked at the card. "I know, Dad." Earl Hughes arrived at the hospital at 11:34 a.m. and navigated the administration with the patient, immovable determination of a man who had once talked a 757 through a Venezuelan thunderstorm, using nothing but his voice and a very detailed knowledge of the aircraft's systems, and who did not consider visiting hours a meaningful obstacle. He found Wren in the family waiting room, sitting with an untouched cup of coffee and the particular stillness of someone who had been still for a long time and had stopped needing to fill the stillness with anything. The two men looked at each other across the room. Earl was 61 and broad-shouldered and white-haired, with the kind of face that decades of alternating between the altitude of cruise flight and the sea-level weight of everything else had weathered into something that looked like it had been tested and had not broken. He had walked away from his airline career believing the most important flying of his life was behind him. He extended his hand. Wren shook it. "You taught her well," Earl said. Wren looked at the door to the hospital room. "I gave her the tools. She knew what to do with them." A pause. "You kept her calm," Wren said. "That was the whole thing. If she'd panicked—" "She wasn't going to panic," Earl said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation, the kind that pilots make about aircraft characteristics, factual, based on evidence certain. "I knew in the first 30 seconds. I've been on the radio with scared pilots for 31 years. I knew." They sat down. The coffee machine in the corner hummed. The corridor outside maintained its steady institutional tempo. "What happens to her now?" Earl asked. "She has a certificate to earn," Wren said. "The right way through the right process." And then he glanced at his untouched coffee. "She's going to fly the 757 again someday. Properly. With authorization, every checklist complete, every maintenance report filed." "She will," Earl said. It was not wishful. It was a statement about the specific future of a specific person based on specific evidence. The hospital room door opened and Zara came out in her own clothes. Now the navy hoodie with the silver-embroidered wings, jeans, sneakers with the IV port, still taped to her arm, and stick and rudder under the other. And she saw Earl Hughes for the first time, and she knew immediately who he was. The way you recognize certain people from a voice before you have seen their face, because the voice and the face are consistent in the way that only honesty produces. "Captain Hughes," she said. He stood up. He was nearly twice her height. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and then he did something that surprised Wren and the nurse in the doorway, and Earl Hughes himself, because he had not planned it. He raised his right hand in a salute, crisp and precise and completely serious, the kind that military and aviation people give each other when the occasion has moved past what language can do. Zara looked at it for 1 second. Then, very solemnly, she saluted back. Earl lowered his hand. His eyes were wet, and he did not apologize for it. "It was an honor to fly with you," he said. "You talked me through the whole thing," she said. "You listened to every word he said." "That's the other half." She nodded. Something settled in her face, not satisfaction, but the particular stillness of someone who has received something they needed and can now put it somewhere permanent. Then she said, "Do you think she would have done it differently?" "My mother." Earl looked at her for a moment. "I never knew your mother." "My uncle told you about her," she said. "On the drive, probably. Or on the phone." Wren from across the room said nothing. Earl thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think your mother would have done it exactly the same," he said carefully. And I think she would have told you that the landing doesn't prove you're a pilot. It's the approach that proves it. He paused. You held your center line through a 13-knot crosswind on short final in a 757. Your first time in the type. Zara looked at him. You were watching on the scope the whole way down. Every foot of it, he said. Something in her face completed its transit, arriving at a place that was not pride exactly, but was the quieter thing under pride, the knowledge settled and permanent of what she was capable of, filed away where it would be available when she needed it. The hospital administrator arrived at the room at 11 a.m., with visible discomfort, which Zara read accurately as the discomfort of someone who was about to ask for something and had decided that the most honest approach was to acknowledge that the asking was awkward. The lobby had reached a point the administrator said where the hospital's ability to function normally was being affected. 11 reporters, 3 camera crews, 2 producers from morning network programs, a woman from the FAA who had been there since 5 a.m. and was not bothering anyone but whose presence had been noted. Would the family consider a brief statement? Just a statement outside on the steps. Not long. Zara thought about it for 30 seconds, genuinely carefully, the way she thought about everything, assembling the available information and assessing what she was actually capable of and deciding whether the decision she made could be stood behind. Okay, she said, but I have conditions. The administrator blinked. Gloria Osei needs to be there. Captain Earl Hughes. Priya Desai, is she here? She drove up this morning, Wren said. She's in the lobby. She brought her daughter. Then Priya, too. Zara looked at the administrator with the level, unhurried directness that was simply how she looked at things. This wasn't just me. If I stand in front of cameras, they stand with me. At 11:30 a.m., Zara Coleman stood on the steps of Denver Health Medical Center in her own clothes. The navy hoodie jeans, sneakers flanked by Gloria Osei on her left and Earl Hughes on her right, with Priya Desai behind them, and Priya's daughter Amara standing at her mother's side staring at Zara, with the pure, uncomplicated wonder of an 8-year-old who had just understood imperfectly but completely that the world was larger and more astonishing than she had previously given it credit for. The cameras were running before Zara finished arranging herself on the step. The noise was considerable questions already forming in the air, reporters calling her name, and she waited for it to settle, which it did not do. And she waited anyway. And after a moment the noise recognized the waiting and subsided into something manageable. 4 people kept 222 people alive yesterday, she said. Her voice carried without effort, landing clearly in the crowd without being raised. Not 1. 4. She gestured slightly to her left and right. Gloria Osei made the decision to let me into that cockpit when she had no reason to trust me except that she was paying attention to what the situation required. Captain Hughes talked me through every instrument on that aircraft from a room in Denver while I was at 37,000 feet. Priya Desai cleared the airspace, ran the approach and said things to me on that radio that made me believe I could do what needed to be done. If any one of those 3 people had been different, a little less focused, a little less skilled, a little less committed to their job, the outcome would have been different. Please understand that. The cameras ran. Nobody interrupted. I also want to say, and I have thought about how to say this, so bear with me, that what happened yesterday didn't have to happen. There was a faulty sensor on that aircraft that was known to be faulty. That sensor would have detected the carbon monoxide. If it had been working, none of this happens. 2 pilots don't collapse. I stay in seat 14A and finish my book and land in Boston. That part of the story is not about bravery. It's about accountability, and it deserves at least as much attention as I'm getting right now. At the back of the crowd, standing in the specific way of someone who has come to observe rather than participate, was a woman in a dark coat who had not spoken since she arrived, and who no one in the crowd appeared to notice, because she was not doing anything that drew attention, simply standing still and listening. Her name was Elaine Whitmore. She had driven to the hospital that morning without quite knowing what she intended to do when she arrived, driven by something she could not name. Precisely. Not guilt, because the guilt belonged to someone else, but the particular anguish of someone whose love for a person has been complicated by what that person turned out to be capable of, who is now standing in the gap between the person they knew and the actions that person took, and trying to determine whether the gap is crossable. She had stood across the street for 40 minutes before the crowd formed. She had moved to the back of it when the statement began. She had listened to every word. When the crowd began to disperse, she turned to leave. "Ma'am." She turned. Zara Coleman was looking directly at her across the thinning crowd, 20 feet, a clear line between them and Zara's eyes on hers, with the quiet, specific attention of someone who has seen something and named it correctly. Elaine Whitmore's face had been doing everything she had spent the past 24 hours trying to prevent it from doing. It was doing those things now. She did not cry, but the effort of not crying was visible at the distance between them. Zara walked toward her. Wren took a step forward, protective automatic, and Zara held up her hand briefly. "I've got this." He stopped. She stood in front of Elaine Whitmore and looked at her. "You didn't do it," Zara said quietly. "And you're standing here, which means you know the difference between what he did and what you did." "That's not nothing." Elaine pressed her hand to her mouth. She nodded once, a single small movement. Then she turned and walked away quickly, not looking back, and Zara watched her go and said nothing more because there was nothing more to say, and she understood this. Wren appeared at her shoulder. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. They stood together for a moment in the dispersing crowd, and the morning moved around them, and neither of them said anything else about it. That evening, the hospital room was quiet in the way that hospital rooms are quiet when the crisis has passed and the machinery of recovery has taken over the steady, functional hum of equipment. The occasional soft footfall in the corridor, the particular institutional stillness of a place where time moves slowly and carefully. Wren was asleep in the chair in the corner, the way he could sleep anywhere seated, quickly, completely. A skill he had developed over years of waiting on flight lines and in ready rooms. Her father had gone to get food. The IV line had been disconnected. The oxygen concentrator was off. Zara's phone lit up on the nightstand. An unknown number. She almost let it go. She picked it up. The message read, "This is Daniel Reeves, First Officer Flight 391. I woke up this afternoon. They told me what happened. I've been lying here trying to find the right words, and I don't have them yet. But I needed you to know that I know what you did, and I know what it cost, and I'm sorry I couldn't be the one doing my job. Doctor." She looked at the message for a long time. Then she typed, "I'm glad you're okay." She set the phone down on the nightstand and lay back and looked at the ceiling and let herself finally all at once completely fall apart, quietly alone in the dim room, the way that private people do, the most important things without an audience, without performance, just the dark and the feeling and the letting it be what it actually was. She cried for a few minutes. Then she breathed. Then she slept. She woke at 6:14 a.m. to Wren's voice in the hallway, which was not using its indoor register. I understand that he was saying with the focused patience of someone who was being patient entirely through an act of will rather than inclination. "What I'm telling you is that she is 11 years old, and she has not eaten a real meal since yesterday morning, and I am not moving from this door until that changes. Do we understand each other?" A second voicemail, apologetic, said something she couldn't quite make out. "Then you can wait in the lobby," Wren said. The hallway went quiet. Zara looked at the ceiling. The early morning light was pressing against the curtains the way light does when the world outside has already started and is not waiting for you to be ready. The door opened and Wren came in carrying a paper bag that smelled like eggs and a coffee that was clearly his and an orange juice that was clearly hers, and he set everything on the tray table and sat in the chair and looked at her with the expression of a man who had slept 4 hours in a hospital chair and was not going to acknowledge this under any circumstances. "How's the head better? Eat first." She opened the bag. Breakfast sandwich. Hash browns. Practical warm. The kind of food that existed specifically for mornings that had been preceded by difficult nights. She ate in silence and he drank his coffee, and neither of them forced conversation because they had always been good at silence together, which was one of the things that had made him exactly the right person to teach her to fly. "How many are in the lobby?" she asked eventually. He considered being vague. He decided against it. 11 reporters, 3 camera crews, 2 morning show producers. A pause. And Sandra Mwangi, who has been there since 5 and brought her own coffee and is not bothering anyone. And Dad lands at 8:15. He was on the red-eye. He needs to see you. Don't fight him on that. I'm not going to fight him. At 9:30 a.m., the airline's communications director standing at a podium with the airline's logo behind him and the careful body language of someone who has been thoroughly briefed on what to say and is saying exactly that, and nothing more, read a prepared statement that expressed the airline's regret, outlined its commitment to a thorough internal review, and announced the appointment of an external safety oversight body that would have full access to all maintenance records going forward. Derek Albright was not at the podium. He was not at the airline's offices. He would not be at the airline's offices again because the board had met at 8 a.m., and the meeting had lasted 14 minutes, and the outcome had not been ambiguous. The statement named Zara Coleman. It named Gloria Osei and Earl Hughes and Priya Desai. It committed in language that had been reviewed by lawyers and had survived the review, because it was true to a complete restructuring of the maintenance reporting protocol across the fleet. Not a review, not an audit, but a restructuring with mandatory escalation requirements for any safety-critical system deferral and third-party verification for any work order removed from the active queue. Blake Whitmore faced federal charges. The formal proceedings would take months. The outcome, given the documentation Sandra Mwangi had assembled, was not genuinely in question. He knew this, and his attorney knew this, and they were both in their different ways making peace with what came next. What had been built into the structure of the airline's maintenance culture, the pattern of decisions that had made Whitmore's choice possible and unremarkable and, in some internal calculus, reasonable, was finally being taken apart piece by piece. Not because someone had decided to do the right thing, but because the consequences of not doing the right thing had become at 37,000 feet over Idaho impossible to ignore. Late afternoon, the hospital room quiet. James Coleman, sitting across from his daughter in the chair that had been occupied at various points in the past 24 hours by Wren and Sandra Mwangi and Earl Hughes, all the people who had been part of the day that preceded this one. The corridor outside had finally mercifully subsided into something close to normal. "What do you want?" James asked. He said it simply without preamble. "When all of this is done. When the cameras are gone and the paperwork is filed and everything has settled. What do you actually want?" Zara looked at stick and rudder on the tray table. The battered paperback with its 3-color annotations and its dog-eared pages and its smell of old paper and used bookstores and the particular aviation-adjacent memory of her uncle's house on Saturday mornings, which was where she had first held it. "I want to fly," she said, "properly, with a certificate and a logbook and a flight examiner and the complete process, because that's what the process is for, and I want to do it the right way." She paused. "And I want to fly the 757 again, someday, with authorization, every checklist complete, every sensor working." "You will," her father said. It was not wishful. It was a statement about someone he knew. "I know," she said, "but I want to earn that too." She ran her thumb along the spine of the book. Mom used to say the sky doesn't give you anything. It only shows you what you already have. James Coleman looked at his daughter, at her mother's hands, and her uncle's precision, and the specific thing that was only hers that had no name yet and probably didn't need one, and he did not cry, though he wanted to. "She would have loved to see you fly today," he said. Zara looked at the curtained window. Behind it, Denver was moving into evening, the light going amber and long and low, the way it did at altitude in October, the kind of light that made the ground look temporary and the sky look permanent. "She was there," Zara said. "I know she was." 3 months later, Zara Coleman sat in the left seat of a Cessna 172 at a flight school outside Denver, 2 weeks past her 12th birthday, with a CFI named Torres in the right seat and a logbook open on her knee 48 hours, becoming 49. She flew a perfect pattern. She made a perfect landing, smooth and centered and exactly right, the kind of landing that is not lucky, but is the product of attention paid consistently over a long time. She taxied back to the ramp, pulled the mixture to idle cutoff, and sat in the quiet cockpit while the engine ticked and cooled, and the propeller stopped turning, and the world outside the windows resumed its ordinary dimensions. "That's your best one yet," the CFI said. "I know," she said. She opened the logbook and wrote the date, the aircraft type, the duration, the conditions, and in the remarks column, the same 3 words she wrote after every single flight, the words Wren had told her to write, the words her mother had always believed, the words that had been true at 37,000 feet in a 757 and were true here in a Cessna, and would be true in every aircraft she would ever fly. Paid attention. She closed the logbook. Somewhere in the future there was a Boeing 757 waiting the proper approach, the proper authorization, every checklist complete, every sensor working, every maintenance report filed without exception the way it was supposed to be. She had a long way to go to get there. She knew exactly how to get there. One decision at a time, one 30-second interval at a time, eyes on the instruments and hands steady, and her mother's sky above her vast and indifferent and absolutely magnificent. She had already proven at 37,000 feet, with 222 lives in her hands, what she was made of. Everything from here was just flying. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, because the stories that need to be told are not the ones that end when the cameras go away. They are the ones about what happens after, about the quiet work of earning what you were given in the worst moment of your life and turning it into something that lasts. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.